Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure for us to be here at DEFCON 33. And honestly, it's exciting just to see so many people here interested in building this malware. So thank you for coming. I'm not going to ask questions. I suppose you want to develop malware, but whatever. Before diving in, we want to make something very clear right from the start so everyone is on the same page, okay? This is not a talk about theoretical Bootkit and Rootkit development. What we are going to share with you today is a fully functional working piece of malware that we have developed. And in a moment, we will explain why we have chosen to make it public. So during this talk, we will share with you a complete documented Bootkit ready for you to use, build, and study. Alongside that, a rootkit as well that implements some cool techniques to modify the Windows kernel. We will also point you to a repository with over 400 curated resources that you can use to carry out your own research into Bootkits and Rootkits. And because setting up the environment can be half the battle, you will have access to a set of scripts we use to automate the entire setup. And well, by the way, this talk ends with a demo, a real vulnerable computer. We have right here this Lenovo, showing the Bootkit in action with secure boot enabled, taking control of the Windows kernel and running the entire malware exactly as designed. We hope you enjoy. My name is Alejandro. I'm a geek, which of course stands for a gentleman, as you can see. A gentleman exploring UEFI and OS kernels, or at least that's what I like to say. And she's Maria.
Hi, everyone. I'm Maria, also a geek, a girl who explores exploits and kernel threats. You can find our full biographies on the official DEFCON page. But to summarize, I work in a law enforcement cybercrime department, where I've spent the last few years analyzing malware. Don't worry, I'm not working right now. This is a set place. Meanwhile, Alejandro is a red team operator focused on Windows internals. So we are two geeks with two different perspectives, two octopus lovers ready to publish a Bootkit for the entire world to use. And the question is, why? Why are we publishing this? Well, we want every offensive team out there, every red teamer, to walk away from here today with a real Bootkit and a rootkit they can actually use in their operations, and the knowledge to develop their own. Instead of spending a year crawling the internet, piecing together scattered bits of information, and trying to figure it all out, you'll have it today, ready to customize, improve, and build your own in just a few months. This entire subject fascinates us, and we believe it shouldn't feel like some kind of dark magic. Building a rootkit and a Bootkit isn't about having a secret knowledge locked away. It's about having the right guidance, the right resources, and the time to learn. So over the next 45 minutes, we're going to explain everything in a very straightforward way, plain language. We want absolutely everyone to walk away with a clear understanding of what this is and how it works. That's what this talk is about.
So let's get started, guys. A Bootkit is a program designed to implant itself as early as possible in the system's boot process. It gains control over every stage of the system startup and modifies the entire boot flow, which we will break down shortly. How does it do that? By hooking and patching key functions in files involved in the boot sequence. Those hooks and patches are what allow the Bootkit to keep executing while the boot sequence continues, and to install components that remain alive even after the operating system takes control. A Bootkit is just a rootkit that runs before the operating system is loaded. So what a rootkit is? Well, a rootkit is another program designed to run inside the kernel, the core of the operating system. Because it operates at the kernel level, and the kernel manages memory, processes, and interrupts, the malware can do almost anything. It can hide files, network connections, disable security protections, and modify the internal structures of the operating system. Now, someone who wants to get started in this field doesn't really understand a damn thing about these definitions. So let's demystify it. On any system, you will find kernel-mode drivers, legitimate components that run at the highest privilege level inside the kernel. Now, if you take that same concept and make it malicious, you get what we call a rootkit, a malicious kernel-mode driver designed to directly tamper with the kernel. And if the computer uses UEFI BIOS to boot, then the starting point of the boot process is a UEFI application. So a malicious UEFI application is what fits the definition of a bootkit. At its core, there are two main components we need to develop. Later, we will see there are more. But as the foundation, a malicious UEFI application, .EFI binary for the early boot stage, and a malicious kernel-mode driver, .sys file, to modify the operating system once it's loaded. And now that we have demystified them, it's worth mentioning, you will find official documentation from Microsoft and from the UEFI forum available to help you build both of them. This is not dark magic, it's just offensive software development. But of course, it's not just about reading the official documentation. There are some amazing resources out there, almost like sacred texts, that you simply cannot miss. If you really want to understand what's going on under the hood, start here. And well, of course, huge thanks to all the amazing folks that explored this subject before us and shared their knowledge, malware, and tools with the entire community. Now it's our turn to give something back.
By now, we can summarize it like this. A bootkit is essentially a malicious UEFI application, and a rootkit is essentially a malicious kernel-mode driver. We already know the two main components we need to develop. But what actually prevents us from just installing them? Well, we are two protection mechanisms we need to talk about. First, we have secure boot. Secure boot is all about a chain of trust, enforced through digital signatures and cryptographic keys. When it's enabled, every component in the boot process must be signed by a trusted vendor and verified against a list of allowed keys. That's the point. Malicious UEFI applications, bootkits, simply won't run unless they are signed by a key that the firmware trusts. But like any system, and we've listed a few CVEs there, if you exploit a weakness, or in this case, you find a way to include your own key into the chain and sign your binary with it, the whole thing collapses. And once secure boot is bypassed, every protection that comes after, including what the operating system tries to enforce, basically doesn't matter anymore. But because if you control the boot, you control everything. So what happens when 2 geeks find a machine vulnerable to one of these flaws? Well, that's exactly what you'll see in our final demo. The second protection we need to talk about is a driver signature enforcement, or DSE. If you already compromised the boot process, this protection doesn't really matter anymore. But let's assume you didn't. Maybe you couldn't find a vulnerability to break the boot signature chain. In that case, you can't install the full bootkit, but you can still find a way to install just the rootkit part. The problem is, Windows won't let you just load a malicious kernel-mode driver unless it's properly signed either by Microsoft or by a trusted vendor. As you can see on the screen, if you try to drop your sys file into the system and load it, you'll get an error saying the signature is invalid. That's DSE doing its job. But there are ways around it. And one of them is the technique called bring your own vulnerable driver. The idea is, instead of loading your malicious driver directly, you first load a legitimate signed driver with a known vulnerability. And once that vulnerable driver is running, you exploit it to execute arbitrary code in kernel space and load your rootkit from there. The vulnerability you use can't be too well known, because Microsoft maintains a block list of drivers which are already known to be abused for this technique, and it won't allow them to load. But at the end of the day, it's a constant cat-and-mouse game. As new vulnerable drivers are discovered, attackers use them, Microsoft eventually blocks them, and the cycle keeps going. Now let's quickly recap. A UEFI bootkit starts with a malicious UEFI application. A rootkit starts with a malicious kernel-mode driver. To install either of these components, there are protection mechanisms you'll need to bypass. There are public vulnerabilities, public exploits, and proven techniques you can adapt to get each part, each component of the bootkit we're sharing, up and running.
So, to understand how our bootkit or rootkit behaves, you first need to understand the boot process. And here is the general idea. When you press the power button, the system performs an operation called power on self-test or POST, a process that checks the hardware to make sure the essential components are working properly. After that, UEFI firmware is executed and it looks for the files and partitions required to boot. One of the first files it loads is the Windows Boot Manager, a legitimate UEFI application found in a special disk partition called the ESP, UEFI System Partition. The Windows Boot Manager loads the Windows OS loader, which loads the operating system kernel into memory. And from there, the operating system takes control and initializes its main subsystems. So we have three key files involved in this process: the Windows Boot Manager, the Windows OS loader, and the Windows NT kernel. Three files you will want to load into your disassembler, reverse engineer to understand their inner workings, and figure out exactly which functions to hook and patch, just as we mentioned earlier, in order to take control of the process. This is the simplified explanation of how the malware works. Remember, each component in the boot chain loads the next one into memory. So at specific moments in the process, the next component, the next file is already in memory, but it has not yet taken control. That's the key. Those moments are when we can hook functions inside that next component, keeping our code in execution as the process continues. We begin by replacing the Windows Boot Manager with our own malicious version. This malicious version, or UEFI application, hooks a function inside the firmware responsible for loading the original boot manager. But instead of immediately passing control to it, our code ensures that the original boot manager is fully loaded into memory first. Once it's loaded, and these right here are one of the most important lines among the thousands that make up the bootkit, once it's loaded in memory, we scan the memory using a known pattern to locate a specific function in that file that is called when the next component is already in memory. Then we hook it by patching its entry point with a small assembly trampoline, redirecting the execution to our own custom handler, and then back to the original function, keeping our code without breaking the boot process. We repeat the same approach at each stage. So inside the Windows Boot Manager, we hook a function that is called when the OS loader is already in memory. Then inside the OS loader, we hook a function that is called when the NT kernel is already in memory. Hook by hook, stage by stage, we maintain control through the entire boot process. But these hooks don't just keep the bootkit alive. Along the way, we also use specific functions in these files to drop the rootkit, the malicious kernel-mode driver, in memory at the right moment. So the rootkit is ready and running by the time the operating system starts. And now let's see a quick demo. Okay, the first one. So here we have an unsigned kernel-mode driver. We're going to try and load it in a common way, and you're going to see an error because the DSE is enabled. So what we're going to do now is perform an advanced restart, and we're going to change the way we boot. We're going to boot into the ESP, the UEFI system partition, because in a specific folder in that partition, we have our malicious UEFI application. We're going to go to that folder. We're going to execute that UEFI application, and the UEFI application is going to modify the entire boot flow. And we have configured the application to drop the rootkit in memory. Well, we provide you with a tool to create the UEFI, to create the configuration the UEFI application uses, because the UEFI application can drop something in memory, modify partitions, can disable security protections. But in this demo, we have only configured the UEFI application to drop the rootkit in memory. So as you are going to see now, in a moment, there is something in kernel space that is printing, hey, hello, hello, hello. There is something in kernel space that can modify the entire operating system, how the operating system works. And we're going to explain that in a moment, but you can also use that a user mode application like that hello.exe to communicate with the kernel mode driver. And something important to note is that the UEFI application can disable DSE. Of course, you can configure the application to do it, but it's not necessary, it's not mandatory to drop the rootkit in memory. In fact, as you are going to see in a moment, DSE is still enabled because we see the error, but a rootkit is already in memory. Moment.
Now, let's take a moment to talk about the power of the UEFI specification itself. When we think about a bootkit, it's easy to just focus on hooking boot functions, but UEFI applications are not limited to redirection or patching. A UEFI application can interact with a wide range of low-level services because the UEFI specification spans thousands of pages, covering protocols for managing memory, file systems, and even networking. That means the first element of the malware we build, before the operating system even loads, can fetch files from a remote server on the internet, modify partitions, create logs, and leave markers for later payloads. In other words, you can do almost anything you want using a UEFI application. And a word of advice. If you ever decide to go through all the thousands of pages of this specification, don't bother with coffee. It's useless. You'll need at least a couple of beers. Continuing with UEFI. UEFI defines two major service categories. Boot services, which are only available during the early boot process, is the blue zone. And then runtime services, which remain available even after the operating system has taken control. That's the orange zone. This distinction is crucial because every UEFI application relies on boot services, so all the memory and the resources it sets up are discarded once a call is made to terminate exit boot services and the operating system takes control. We've already loaded the rootkit into memory by this stage, so losing boot services doesn't really hurt us. But if we design our code with this in mind, we can take advantage of runtime services to establish something during boot that persists even after our application itself is gone. One way to achieve this is by developing a DXC runtime driver, a special kind of UEFI driver that stays in memory after the boot and allows you to hook runtime services. In other words, it plants hooks that remain active while the system is running. This gives you an almost invisible backdoor, which allows you to execute arbitrary payloads and read or write anywhere in memory. So at this point, what is our bootkit in practice? It consists in two main components. First, a UEFI application that cooks key functions to stay alive through the boot process, drops the rootkit into memory at the right moment, disables security protections if needed, and takes full advantage of the UEFI specification. And second, a malicious DXC runtime driver, acting as a backdoor that can read and write in memory while the system is running.
So let's see the second device. This one. So as you can see here, we have an HTTP server app. we're going to do the same we did in the first demo. We're going to boot into the ESP, and in a specific folder, you're going to see two files, the UEFI application and the DX0 runtime driver. We're going to execute the UEFI application, and the UEFI application is going to download a UEFI utility in the disk, okay? We don't use that UEFI utility in this demo, but if you see the source code that is completely available, you're going to realize what new capabilities this UEFI utility gives me. The UEFI application is going to load the DX0 runtime driver in memory too, and well, it downloaded that file. And now the DX0 runtime driver is in memory because the UEFI application loaded it. We have developed a tool to communicate with the DX0 runtime driver. So, well, something important to know is give me a moment, I have to pause here. You have to execute that UEFI, you have to execute the program we developed with admin privileges, okay? That's very important to know, to communicate with the DX0 runtime driver. So we're going to use that specific tool first to check if the DX0 runtime driver is in memory. He is going to say, oh yeah, I'm alive. So now we can drop another malicious components in memory. We can execute payloads, we can execute shellcodes, we can read and write anywhere in memory. And we have configured a specific functionality to communicate with the DX0 runtime driver and say, hey, I want you to load this rootkit. I want you to load this malicious kernel-mode driver. And it loaded. So now you have two ways to load something in memory, to load the rootkit. You can use the UEFI application, or you can use the DX0 runtime driver to drop something in memory that, as we are going to see now in a moment, can modify how the operating system works, okay? The core of the malware and what truly gives the Bootkit its power is the rootkit. The rootkit is the component that lives in kernel space, operates with the highest privileges, and enables deep manipulation of the system. From intercepting callbacks to hiding files and network activity, the rootkit is what delivers full control. In fact, everything we have discussed so far, UEFI, hookings, early boot hijacking, runtime drivers, has just been the setup. It's all part of the infection chain that ensures the rootkit runs reliably. Sorry, it didn't work. No. Okay, as you can see in the right circle, a rootkit, it could be, but most of the time a rootkit is not just a malicious kernel-mode driver, okay? There are more components that make up this concept, all working in a coordinated way. So the question now is, what makes this rootkit we have built, this driver, a good one? What key aspects did we focus on to give it a solid foundation and meaningful capabilities? Well, there are more techniques implemented, as you will see in the source code, but we think these 6 form the essential foundation to start with. First, communication. A good rootkit must be able to communicate either with a user LAN application, with a command and control server, or both, while still being capable of acting autonomously when necessary. This is what allows you to send instructions, receive responses, and adapt the driver's behavior on demand. Second, direct kernel object manipulation. This is what allows the rootkit to, for example, do something as fundamental as hiding a process. And while that may sound simple, now in 2025, it has to be done the right way, otherwise you risk triggering a protection and crashing the system with a blue screen. Third, keystroke logging. It's also possible to capture keystrokes at the kernel level, intercepting some kind of packets, okay? Fourth, network filtering. By leveraging the Windows filtering platform technology, the rootkit can alter, block, and capture network traffic in real time. Fifth, kernel-level command and control manipulation. As you can see on the screen, WinSock kernel, okay, remember that concept, WinSock kernel allows the rootkit to make HTTP connections entirely within the driver, okay? So enabling a full command and control in kernel space, okay? So this is very important. You don't need a userland process to communicate with a server on the internet, download files, or even handle network connections or communications, because the driver can handle all of it on its own, okay? And finally, file system filtering. There is a special class of drivers that many security solutions use called mini filters, and the rootkit can also make use of the underlying technology behind those drivers to hide and deny the access to specific files and folders, effectively preventing the operating system and other tools from analyzing them. So we're going to see a rootkit with these 6 capabilities, okay? Sorry. We're going to boot into the ESP. In the ESP, we have a bootkit, we have a malicious UEFI application. We're going to execute the UEFI application. The UEFI application is going to modify the entire boot flow and is going to drop our rootkit in memory, okay? We have developed a user mode application to communicate with the rootkit, okay? You don't need admin privileges to open this, to execute this application. We're going to use this user mode application to communicate with the kernel-mode driver and saying, hey, well, the first thing we're going to try is hiding a process. We're going to try and hide the OneDrive.exe process with that specific PID. It's going to fail because we have to execute some commands to see if the kernel-mode driver is in memory. So we execute them, and now you're going to see how that specific line is going to be printed in red, and the process disappeared from the eyes of the user, well, from the eyes of the task manager, and in this case, the process hacker program. We can list the hidden processes, and we can unhide in an easy way only with the identifier, and the process appears again. We can do the same with files and folders. So we're going to copy specific folder here, and we're going to communicate with the kernel-mode driver and say, hey, I don't want the user to see that specific file. We reload it and disappeared. We communicate again with the kernel-mode driver and it appeared again. It's like there is something in kernel space that modify how the operating system works, okay? We can block connections too. Maybe we don't want the computer or the user to be able to communicate with some kind of IP addresses, some servers on the internet, some range. We block those IP addresses, and the user, the machine cannot communicate with them. There is something in kernel space that deny those communications. And we can unhide hide network connections too. We execute netstat. As you can see, there are some TCP connections to the remote port 443. We communicate with the driver and say, hey, I don't want the user to see those connections. Maybe there is a shellcode or whatever. We execute netstat again, and the connections disappear from the eyes of the user. The thing is, you don't need a user mode application to communicate with the driver. You can develop some kind of alternative ways of communication. You can, for example, enable a keylogger. Okay, the driver can capture, as you are going to see in a moment, can capture every keystroke you type, okay? So you can use the keylogger to communicate with the driver, so you don't need the application. And we're going to show you that everything, well, we have categorized everything in different techniques. We have seen something related with, with direct kernel object manipulation, hiding a process, keyboard filtering, NSI, UEFI, mini filter, and now WSK, WinSock kernel. As I said before, this is very important. You can enable a fully command and control channel entirely within the driver. So you enable the command and control, and the driver is going to call your server on the internet, and your server responds, hey, I want you to execute this thing, and the driver is going to execute it. We don't, in this version, we don't provide you a full command and control. In the source code, you can find everything you need to develop your own command and control in kernel space. But, that is the idea. You can wait a few months, and we're going to release that as well. So, we cannot explain these 6 techniques in detail, okay? But you have all the source code, and not just the Rootkit source code itself, but also standalone proof of concepts for each example. There is a POC just for communication, another just for how to hide a process, another just for the keylogger, and so on. That being said, understanding how a user mode application communicates with a kernel mode driver is crucial. Learning the fundamentals of how IOCTLs and how IRPs work is going to give you a solid foundation and will naturally prepare you to move on to exploiting vulnerabilities in kernel mode drivers as you progress in this area. That's going to be something you're going to introduce yourself as you progress, okay? I hate doing this, but I don't have so much time. So communication, you have some work to do at home. So communication, kernel structure manipulation, keyboard filtering, network filtering, kernel level command and control, file system filtering, and of course the entire boot process infection chain we have been talking about, along with the security bypasses we mentioned at the beginning. All of that brings us here. And we're going to see the last demo, okay? This Lenovo is vulnerable, by the way. Okay, so we are in a physical machine. The Bootkit works in virtual machines and physical machines. So we're going to install the Bootkit, the UEFI Bootkit. You need admin privileges to install the Bootkit. We are going to execute, we're going to pause it here. We execute a script. Everything is available, so don't worry. We execute a script and to check if secure boot is enabled. And yes, secure boot is enabled, as you see on the screen, but there is some kind of flaw in the UEFI firmware, so who cares if secure boot is enabled or not? The machine is vulnerable. We install the UEFI Bootkit. We add a new boot entry by default. I'm going to, the internet connection was slow and we have to download something. So the Rootkit is the Bootkit, the UEFI Bootkit is installed. The malicious UEFI application is installed. So now we shut down the machine. We power on again, and the UEFI Bootkit is there. The UEFI Bootkit, you can configure the Bootkit to not show the messages. Okay, the UEFI Bootkit dropped the Rootkit or Rootkit in memory. Well, no, sorry. By default, we have configured the UEFI application to drop some kind of basic kernel mode driver, some kind of basic rootkit, in memory, so you can use that specific kernel-mode driver. You can communicate with it and say, hey, I want you to load another kernel-mode driver. We do it by default this way because maybe you want to load or Rootkit, or maybe you want to load the proof of concept we give you to blind IDRs, or you want to load your own Rootkit, okay? So by default, the UEFI application dropped a basic kernel-mode driver in memory, and you can communicate, as you can see in the screen, you can communicate with that specific kernel-mode driver and say, hey, I want you to load another one, okay? So this machine is fully compromised. There are no more levels, okay? All right, now that you have seen the final demo, it's time to take out your phones and make a picture of this of the screen. On the screen, you will see 6 QR codes. This gives you access not just to everything we showed here today, but much more. Okay, starting from the top row, left to right, the first QR takes you to the ABIS repository, or UEFI Bootkit project. It includes the UEFI application, basic kernel-mode drivers that the UEFI application can drop in memory, the DXE runtime driver, the tool to communicate with the DXE runtime driver, some setup scripts, the tool to create the encrypted configuration the UEFI application uses, and a massive amount of documentation on how to get started in developing bootkits. Okay, so everything you need to develop your first UEFI bootkit from scratch is there in the first QR. Okay. The second takes you to the Bentic repository, or full-featured kernel-mode rootkit. You will find the kernel-mode driver, the application to communicate with the kernel-mode driver, and a dozen of proof of concepts for each technique implemented, and documentation as well. The third QR takes you to a repository with hundreds of resources you can use to dive even deeper into this subject. On the bottom row, the first QR, I think, it gives you access to a set of scripts we use to automate the entire development environment setup. You need to configure something to develop bootkits and rootkits in a machine. So you can execute our scripts, and it's completely automatically. The second QR, that's a good one, the second QR. There is some notes there to install the rootkit on a physical real machine. And the last one includes some notes to help you analyze your own UEFI firmware and check for known vulnerabilities, okay? We believe this is the first time so much documentation and code has been shared with the entire community to help you build both a bootkit and a rootkit. But that was the idea, to provide anyone looking to deliver adversary simulation services with the knowledge to emulate the kind of malware only APTs deploy. And last thing we want to say is, as you can see on the screen, our lovely dog, Shira, passed away recently, and without her, we wouldn't be here. So you all owe her a big thank you for making this talk possible. And that's all from us. If you want to see, or if someone wants to see a live demo, we have the vulnerable computer right here. We are very approachable people, and we have some cool stickers too. So, that's all from us. Enjoy the malware, okay? You are not going to find anything like this on the internet. This is very, very cool. So enjoy it. See you soon, guys.